Welcome to this FinTech Outside In panel discussion. It is brought to you by Basalt Technology. Today we'll discuss the importance of how to future-proof the banking industry. It is important now, more than ever before. Banks face a challenge of managing the pace of innovation while maintaining core banking systems. This will help guide entrepreneurs in the financial services industry as well as guide decision makers at the banks to future-proof their businesses. The panel today are leading decision makers across the banking sector and some award-winning fintech entrepreneurs. The panel today is Symmie Swil. She is a banking veteran and is currently the head of business operations for Investec's corporate and investment bank in the UK. Wayne Zwiers, he is the CEO and founder of Basalt Technology, an award-winning fintech company. He has also garnered several industry accolades, including Africa's Tech CEO of the Year. Kenneth Kayser is a multi-award-winning innovator and has experience building fintech solutions across multiple industries. He co-founded Barclays Rise Africa and also developed innovative fintech solutions for Nedbank corporate and investment banking. Last but not least is Steve Ullman. He's a CA and the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer of a fast-growing regulated fintech company based in the UK. Thank you for joining me. Banking is one of the critical industries in the world actually now, especially in this volatile times we live in. And the theme of today's discussion is future-proof banking and especially the role fintech plays in the whole process of developing innovation and then rolling out solutions. So not only focused on consumers, but also to improve efficiencies and limiting fraud and money laundering in this whole process. Wayne, I want to start with you. You are in the fintech space. It's a very innovative space. How do you find the regulatory environment in which you operate and how it links into the whole banking system?
In every market, there's a strong emphasis on data privacy and data management, and fintechs and financial services have to incorporate robust data management processes into every solution they put forward. And in South Africa, compliance. And then just looking at the European market with the PSD2 and the new regulations that will apply across the EU will arguably result in a huge increase in the number of APIs for banking products. And this is a major development for fintechs worldwide, as well as advancements for banks too, to partner with fintechs. The landscape's changing and especially led by the UK in the PSD2 space.
And Symmie, from a banking perspective, of course, regulations is critical and obviously then working with sometimes small parties. How does that gel?
There's probably two ways to look at the regulations from a bank perspective. One of those are the constraints that, like Wayne mentioned, will interact with how you deal with the fintechs. So privacy, but also banks are obviously concerned around the robustness of their outsourcing arrangements. So the EBA came out with guidance that outsourcing includes using cloud providers. So you should be aware that banks need to be thinking about the ability to take some of those services back in-house if they're using a fintech provider, depending on the materiality of that outsourcing, which is changing the relationship they have with their partners. There's all this regulatory change that's happening that is driving what they want to invest in and how they're going to be changing their products in order to take advantage of those regulations. And that's where the fintechs can come in and say, okay, here's an opportunity to either compete or let us partner with you. So, anti-money laundering, even things like IBOR, capital and liquidity changes, PSD2, obviously. So there's actually a lot more opportunity, I think, for fintechs there, but they just need to be aware of how banks will be considering what their robustness is when they're thinking of how they partner.
Steve, banks are being perceived as these big bureaucratic institutions. They follow rules to the letter. And that's almost the opposite of what a small IT company does. It's really innovative, decisions are taken quickly. How do you marry those two?
So a lot of banks have got outdated systems, so they've had them for years. And therefore, in order to basically update them, they need the various legacy people there to actually know how the system works. A lot of banks in Europe have suffered in respect of money laundering sort of sanctions against them. So basically, regulators are looking at banks saying, how are your controls in respect to this area? Whereas actually you've got fintechs basically can provide innovation. They're smaller, they're more, shall we say, nimble in providing this sort of technology, and therefore can partner with banks saying, we've got this particular technology that might be useful to you. So for a bank who, rather than actually building their own system, which will cost tens and tens of millions, it's much easier for them to partner with someone else like a fintech on that basis and use their system. And also it allows the fintech, one, access to a massive customer base.
From a banking perspective, what Steve just said, there are legacy issues within bank systems, issues within banks. How do you approach new fintech implementation within the current architecture, the IT architecture in the banking system?
Banks are, definitely, at least some of the trends that I've been seeing, are modernizing some of the legacy tech into more microservice-based, API-based capabilities, and migrating a lot of those capabilities, like many other businesses, to the cloud. And I think, through the creation of microservices and APIs, it then allows them to seamlessly work with different fintechs. Locally, Nedbank launched its API marketplace, and it went through that process of modernizing its legacy technology. And now it has the ability to seamlessly integrate with a number of fintechs using various APIs. Wayne mentioned the PSD2 regulation, particularly in the payment space, where banks in the UK and the EU were forced to open up some of the APIs around payments. And we probably see a similar trend from a South Africa perspective. I think just last week, the Open Banking Excellence Division released a statement around API standards and adoptions around API standards. And I think banks and regulators locally are definitely looking at that. So banks moving away from legacy tech into microservices, API-based, let's call it capabilities, which allows for seamless interaction with fintechs.
Symmie, a lot of acronyms there. It seems like it's a very complicated area, and I know there's so much concerns about security. Are there any security risks when you actually look at new product development, introducing new innovations into your system? Where's that on the agenda?
I think probably it's a pain of all of the fintechs, if they want to work with a bank, is to go through our joyful procurement process, and that will obviously require cybersecurity testing. I guess it comes back to the point around, banks, I think, are increasingly wanting to work with fintechs because of the innovation they provide, their ability to move quickly. But they have to also prove that they can deal with the security data and sort of resilience concerns that banks are going to have. So I think increasingly they'll also be looking to fintechs to guide the way on what good security looks like and innovation in that space.
In South Africa, there are perceptions surrounding banks. Some banks are perceived to be more innovative than others. Some are leading with the introduction of new fintech solutions within the bank as well as for customers. Is it easier to work with some banks than others?
It depends, I think, how the bank is perceived. I think banks realise they have to sort of basically digitise their whole system or basically arrangement for the customer, because the customer isn't using branches much these days, and it's been shown by the pandemic, because everyone's using mobile phones or the web-based platform, basically the computer. So therefore, banks have to move with the times, otherwise they're going to get swallowed up by some of the larger challenger banks on that basis.
Wayne?
We work and innovate within banks in the UK and South Africa, and within each one of those, there's innovation inside and outside of the bank. So we've got these moonshot teams and hubs, and then we've got core banking systems, and each serves a purpose and has an objective, which is right or not. What the mistake some people are making is that automation and being efficient is not innovation and disruption. And we need to look at the grassroots digital transformation. So how does that transform digital or banking? So digital banking first, and then look at how does that fit into the customer and being customer centric around their ecosystem. That's what shows the value in terms of how you build this disruptive piece of innovation. And also not to negate the fact that with the current challenges, everyone had the perception that banks couldn't move fast and there was legacy and procurement, but within 24, 48 hours, everyone was working remotely and things had shifted quite quickly in how fast. And it's a lot of what I've seen is the banks were able to do this very quickly with cloud and with technology.
Kenneth, how do banks and fintech companies meet up? I assume you have proposals of hundreds of fintech companies telling you, listen, I can do A, I can do B, but you need to adapt your strategy with the solutions that are available. Is that a difficult process?
I think, fundamentally it comes down to, what are the customer need? What are the problem statements that, either the bank or the fintech is trying to solve for, right? And once understanding that, do the banks then have the right mechanisms in place to engage with the fintechs? And at least what I've seen in some trends is a number of banks setting up accelerators, whereby an incubation spaces that allows them to have access to their fintech ecosystems, leveraging the capabilities of these fintechs. But again, fundamentally, it starts with understanding, what are the needs of the bank and how best these fintech solutions can solve it. With some of the solutions that I've worked on, where fintech solutions, bank partnerships has really worked well, was working with a fintech in Nigeria, using alternate data sets, and using their capability and the capabilities that they've developed through generating alternate data sets, and then combining it with some of the bank's own credit models to then develop a solution that meets the need of the customer. And I think there's a lot of these relationships forming, either through, like I mentioned, bank incubation programs or accelerators. Banks are also looking at partnering with fintechs, not just around product innovation, but also from an investment perspective, where we're seeing more and more of venture capital teams within banks developing investment pipelines as they become opportunities for banks to invest in some of these companies.
Symmie, from your perspective, do you formulate strategy and then go and look for solutions, or do you see a cool solution and you say, hey, we need to do that, and then implement it or integrate it into your product offering? How does that decision-making process take place?
I think it's a mix of both. I think the trick is that the way the bank is, or at least in our case, the way we're thinking about a problem isn't always the way that the fintechs are selling the solution that they have. We know what the problems are within our bank, so we'll constantly be looking out there, say, is there anything that could plug that gap? But obviously, we always have incoming calls from fintechs saying, look, I've got this product. I think the problem you get is when there's a product and the product's cool, but you're not exactly sure how it's going to fit for your solution. And so much of the work is around saying, well, how do we turn this tool into an actual solution? And that is the magic. When you can start talking about the problem in the same terminology and both sides understand, the problem sitting in the legacy systems or in the client base versus what that tool can be enabled for.
Wayne, just back to from a fintech perspective, digitization is a critical element of all banks in the world currently. They're looking to do things better, faster, safer. What role do you think fintechs play in that process?
So I think that the fintechs, the key role is to identify the real pain points of the customer on a day-to-day basis, and then find these transformative ways through technology to solve these pain points. So the fintechs should be the champions on the user and customer experience within the financial services. And we've seen these principles in action in the UK, especially with the challenger brands as Monzo. It's not a fintech versus bank conversation, because we're innovating within the bank and building a trade finance business within the bank. And there it's a startup and an innovative piece as a moonshot. But the value there is that when you're doing it in the right way with the mothership, you actually get your spot price, you get your FedEx, you get your insurance, everything's packaged into that bank. So you can do the end-to-end solution, focusing on the custom interface. So there's that happening in the banks as well, which is really amazing to see too.
Just adding to that, it shows, I think you have to have a partnership with banks, that the fintech does. We're looking at stuff like transaction monitoring, and effectively we're trying to do with AI, so basically predictive analysis. A lot of fintechs don't have the financial big data that is required in order to sort of build a product. So therefore, you have to link up with a financial institution, i.e. a bank, to have that data in order to build a product that's good for the customer, i.e. the bank. And actually, I think that's where we're probably going to see more of partnerships happening between the banks and the fintechs, rather than the fintechs competing with the banks.
Symmie, of course, these relationships are critical for any bank, and it's partnerships. Steve and Wayne have mentioned the word partnerships numerous times now. How do you build those partnerships to become really beneficial for both parties?
Partnerships absolutely key. I think that's where we all see the opportunity, combining the strengths of what the fintechs bring with, as Steve mentioned, the brand, the customer data, the experience and history of the banks. I think the challenge that we're all facing is it is very hard to build those partnerships. How do you find the right partner? How do you get on the same page as to what the problem is? And how do you manage the ongoing relationship? You know, you build the solution and then you want to add things in. You want to continue to develop and you want your partner to grow as a fintech, but the more partners they get, the harder it is for them to manage the various competing demands of all of their different banks. The real opportunity is when you see the fintechs understand the ecosystem they operate in and saying, oh, actually, these are the other partners you need to bring in to provide a holistic solution.
Kenneth, it seems like any bank at any given time are partnering with many different fintech companies. How should a bank manage those relationships?
Again, it comes down to, what are the values, I think, that the fintech partner can provide to the bank, and then understanding, what does that business case look like, and what are the benefits for both the bank's customer and the fintech, and then experimentation is a big part of it. I think banks working with fintechs, you're not always going to get it right. So sometimes some of the banks' models might not be conducive to the ways of work, to where the fintechs are working. So experimentation plays a key part in this process. But fundamentally, it comes down to understanding what are the pain points that you're trying to address, and can that fintech solve for that pain point, and then co-creating solutions together through experimentation.
Steve, what role does new technology play, or new developing technology trends? Of course, we see technology develop at an unbelievable rate, but you need to pull that back into the banking structures. Who drives the digital agenda? Is it the fintechs or the banks?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. You look at the issues that a bank might have, and then you'll say, well, actually, how can you solve them? You look at, as a fintech, you look at where the issues are, i.e. the risks that the banks might face, and then you'll say, actually, where can I provide some effectively benefits? Where can I come in and look at that niche particular market? We look at where we see a potential opening, i.e. where we see potential risks, and then you'll try and develop a product to try and solve that, or work with the bank to solve that problem.
Wayne, what do you think the biggest trends, the technology trends are that is driving banking innovation at the moment?
There's probably three layers when we're working together and around this conversation. And one is core banking. So deep banking, the engine, the cash register of the big banks. A lot built on legacy systems, a lot of secure environments. And then there's a layer on top of that, which is your integration component. So that requires experience on how to integrate into these core banking modules and features, and how do you pull data and how do you configure all that. And then on the top of that, you've got this customer interface layer, which has now become this buzzword of fintech. And one has to understand those three layers, as well as what data and what's the compliance around and architecture in order to do this well. So it's not just picking one component, as you say. You've got to understand banking and banking systems, as well as customer interfaces, and it's all got to work together. And also the architectural structures and how these things are designed is critical, because it's got to be compliant, it's got to be approved by banks as well, to be able to work with banks. It can't just be done on the fly on the side and then arrive and say, well, we got this great fintech here, it solves a problem, but it doesn't tie into any technology or any infrastructure in a bank, or can't strip data or articulate anything out of the banks or back into the bank. So, you have to be vast in the experience across it.
I just want to ask the two bankers, what advice do you have for fintech companies to actually get into a partnership and then to build a long-term relationship that will benefit all the parties, including the customers of the bank? Symmie, let's start with you.
I think it's about understanding who owns the problem in the bank first. So whether that's the client-facing team, whether it's an ops team, whether it's a compliance team. You then need to find who owns the budget, and that may not be the same person who has the problem. And then you need to understand who deals with that problem every day, and from a tech perspective, because they're the ones that are either going to endorse your solution or continue to kick it down the road. I think the challenge is finding those three parties, finding a way to continue to work with them, build a relationship with all of them in order to be able to build that partnership.
And I agree with me. I think, and key is to, in terms of how you're positioning your value proposition. understanding the bank that you're dealing with, its target clients and so forth, and understanding your own capabilities and how does your value proposition add value to the bank, to their clients.
Wayne, listening to that, do you think fintech companies approach banks in the correct way?
Sure, it's hard to answer for other fintechs, but I can probably give you a story. And we were working with one of the banks, and they had a challenge in manual tasks that need to be automated. And we came to a solution on how that works. And that bank went through to the compliance regulator through the audit process. And they said, well, every bank has this problem. So their bank solved their problem. And now it's an actually industry-wide challenge that needs to be solved. So the fintech will then say, how do we partner with you then to co-create this challenge that we can do together, or how do we give it to you and you can then run it in the industry? So opportunities come in strange ways, and I think it's just keeping what is the purpose and the relationship and the trust of how you drive these initiatives, really.
Kenneth, just lastly, we are living in very interesting times. Some people believe this is the biggest black swan event we will see in our generation. Will it affect the way digital strategies are formulated and implemented?
I think, at least what I've seen, some of the trends globally, COVID-19 has been a blessing, I think, in terms of driving the digital banking narrative, getting clients to use more banking solutions digitally. And that's definitely been helpful for the banks, I think, on the one side. So we'll probably see more investments being made into digital banking capabilities, and in particular in the payment space. At least that's a space that I'm in. If I look at South Africa, when it comes to digital payments, I still think there is still a lot of cash still in the economy in terms of where people, using terms of cash-based type of payment capabilities. But yeah, there's definitely a shift happening, and I think COVID can be seen as a crisis, but I think as a banker, it can also be seen as a blessing to get your digital numbers up.
Symmie, from your perspective?
Well, I think it's changing the way all of us are working, whether we're in a bank or in any other industry. And so I think we are obviously becoming more digital, and it's driven that agenda faster in a few ways. But I think the real opportunity is what are the kinds of products and support we'll need to be giving to our clients and to a changing world to support a totally different way of working. I was chatting to Wayne about this briefly before, which was the last crisis resulted in, this boost to the startup sector. It resulted in people having less trust for institutions, which is part of, what's supported P2P and fintechs now. And in a number of countries, in particular the UK, the banks are now essentially providing the state aid through loans. So it's a complete reversal in terms of where they were positioned last crisis. So what does that mean in terms of how people see them and how they're used to interacting with them? Obviously too soon to tell.
That was a very fascinating discussion indeed. Join us again for our next Outside In FinTech panel discussion about trends and innovation in the banking industry.